I'll begin by making some very short remark. I'm so delighted to see all of you here. I think this is the first time that we collaborate with your group, University of Portsmouth, and also with Democratic Citizenship Research Group led by Professor Leila Chakron, a professor of international law. And I looked at her website and the publications she had done. I'm so much impressed because there are so many issues that overlapped with our concerns. Our center actually is also a very much interdisciplinary place. We have people from law, but also anthropology, social work, sciences, literature, history, and art, and so on. So our general theme for us is conflict, justice, decolonization. Of course, decolonization in the 21st century, that's what we will be focusing on in our event next year. So we are mostly doing critical studies of inter-Asian societies, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, and sometimes also Central Asia, because these countries in this region, they actually suffer very much the same trajectories of colonial history in the past, but also post-colonial nation state building, which brings this, we just talked about it just now, this citizenship into a very problematic condition. Okay, this is, but that also affects this flow of migrant labor, but also refugees. Like Rohingya, this is one typical example of the trick of this citizenship, okay, that's played in Southeast Asia and Myanmar. So, so this conflict justice decolonization is our long-term project. So there's exploitation of migrant labor on land and at sea, and also the question of refugees, and there's unequal citizens, it's our central concern. But other than this, there are other research groups focusing on this neoliberal capitalism, which trigger this developmentalism, and also this ethnocentric nationalism. But also there are people working on environmental injustice and eco crisis, and then also artistic intervention and social intervention. So we think this four tracks or four clusters are interconnected. So there are people working on documentaries, also addressing this migrant issue and so on. So I think today this dialogue between Taiwan and Europe is so much, so important and crucial, because this issues or phenomenon doesn't only happen in Mediterranean Sea or Southeast Asia or and so on, but it's a global event. Yeah, mutually affecting or one another. So this is a very important moment for us. I want to, and also this conjunction of our webinars, our human rights and transnational labor mobility workshop that we have been working on it for as a series, okay, this year. But we also had done a series of webinars in the past 2-3 years, okay, in a much wider scope. And this is a conjunction of our series with your series, okay, of this future research future webinar series, right, under your research theme. And Professor Chu will be representing our team She's also from the School of Law as yours. Okay, yours is international law, so you have so much in common. And I also want to thank Bonnie for this today, this event, and also our seminar for this ACS, Association for Cultural Studies, that will be held in January 2023, is also initiated by Yufan and Bonnie. So I'll let Bonnie to introduce the concept of today's meeting and also the speakers from Europe. Okay, Bonnie? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Professor Liu, for such warm introduction. And it is just an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I think at the heart of dialogues like this, you know, the subtitle for this event today, written in Chinese, is Conversation Between Europe and Taiwan. I think it's important to put Taiwan in the international context, and also at the same time, bring some of these international law knowledge to Taiwan, so Taiwan can know where it stands in the international and regional context. Taiwan has to work a little bit harder, right? Because Taiwan is not part of the UN. So a lot of the usual channels where knowledge, such as the ones we're going to discuss today, get transmitted through UN conferences or parallel events. Taiwan doesn't have access to that yet. So I think it's important that we, you know, through all channels, academia is certainly a very important one, civil society channels and everything else, to look at how we can continue this important conversation. And with that in mind, I just want to say that today is actually a little bit like an appetizer event to a big series of events that will come in January, where Liu Jiaoshou and Qiao Jiaoshou of Yangming Jiaotong Daxue have done so much work to bring it together, along with other international partners. Is the Association of Cultural Studies Institute. It's going to be a week long of events and seminars looking at the issues of social justice, environmental justice, marginalization, decolonization, and so forth. So stay tuned. This conversation is just the beginning of a much larger discourse that will continue in the future. I just want to say a quick word, because I am such a fan of your work at Yangming Jiaotong Daxue. You know, you have done so much work for a long time in Chinese, and now more and more people internationally know of your work to foster, you know, such a dynamic scholarship with your students, which is very international, and having the space. You know, you have done some amazing work on migrant fishers in Taiwan's distant water fishing fleet, looking at their abuses, you know. And I just want to thank you, Professor Liu and Professor Qiao, at, you know, plotting at this ground and bringing us all together today. So without further ado, what I will say is we have a lot of people from Portsmouth joining, people who normally would be joining and listening to Professor Leila Shukran, mentoring, hosting scholarship in this area on democratic citizenship. I just want to say that, you know, today is a little bit different because it's a joint event with counterparts in Taiwan. But I just want to spotlight this very unique democratic citizenship research futures webinar series. It first started during the pandemic, when we went through very harsh lockdowns in the UK. And it was started by the theme, Professor Shukran's theme, to look at how, despite the isolation, we can bring people together to continue to think about pressing global challenges of our time. So it's to foster interdisciplinary dialogues and support each other in our, you know, respective research and create very fruitful conversations. So the Research Futures webinar have covered things like what Professor Liu have said, decolonization, race, sustainability and protection of our natural environment, policing, science and technology, and also things like preservation of cultural heritage. And you know, all the webinars are up, openly accessible, and maybe someone can pop it into the chat on how you can find these fantastic webinars online. Now, I have the distinct honor and the very hard task of introducing our speakers today and keep it within the time constraint. So Professor Leila Shukran is a professor of international law and director of the University of Portsmouth theme in democratic citizenship. Her research focuses on the interactions between international trade, investment law, human rights law, development studies, jurisprudence, and social theory. So what this means is that she has a very broad scope and knowledge. I think she has taught pretty much in every area of international law and has mentored a lot of students in different areas. She's a prolific writer. It would be so difficult to mention all the books that she has written, numerous, double digits, in addition to serving on the editorial boards of major book series, focusing on international law in the global South, issues on human rights and citizenship. Moreover, she had served as an independent advisor to international civil society, such as the International Federation of Human Rights. She was a consultant to the OECD. And we met many years ago when she was a researcher at the French Center for Research on Contemporary China in Hong Kong. So our path crossed many years ago. So she's going to bring us her presentation, fusing academia and other sectors as well. This very dynamic picture on what is meant by statelessness when a person does not have citizenship. Our second speaker is Michael Hornig, who is speaking to us from Geneva. And Michael Hornig is a fast-track master's and PhD student of international law at the famed Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And the campus is just, minutes away from the Palais des Nations. And it's a fantastic place to study for people of international relations and international law. And you, Michael, also serve as an external consultant for the Institute for Statelessness and Inclusion, the first and the only, I believe, human rights NGO that focuses exclusively on advocacy to eliminate statelessness globally. Now, before Geneva, Michael was at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies in Belgium as a researcher and lecturer, and served also at the same time as a program, served before that as a program officer for ISI, Institute for Statelessness and Inclusion, for many years. This is after you receiving your LLM, I believe, from Tilburg University from the Netherlands. Michael has also worked for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency in Geneva, and also served as an advisor to the mission of the Netherlands to the UN in New York City. So we have a panel today fusing together academia, practitioner perspectives to focus on the problem of statelessness. So without further ado, let me turn over the floor to Professor Leila Shukran to start with her remarks and introduction. It's such a privilege to have both of you here with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for these really kind words. And before I start, I'd like to thank our colleague from Taiwan, Professor Joyce Liu and Professor Yu Fan Chiu as well. Thank you so much for welcoming me into your webinar series. I've always admired very much the work of Taiwanese scholars. I visited Taiwan a few times, including your school, the law faculty. Always love to collaborate with you. And indeed, the quality of research in Taiwan is particularly impressive. And I'm glad that it's now written in many different languages, in Chinese naturally, but also in English, so that the world can know a bit more about what you're doing, because as I said, the quality is particularly impressive. So thank you so much for inviting me. And as you said, this is an appetizer, the first step to many more collaboration, as we have a lot in common in terms of research interests, ideas, but also I think we're like-minded in the way we approach this particular research, in the sense that we put the human beings and human rights at the center of our studies. I'd like to thank our colleague, Dr. Bonnie Ling, not only for the warm introduction, but also for making us meet, putting people together, supporting the organization of this event across the sea, because as you know, we're living in Portsmouth, but Bonnie lives on the Isle of Wight, so we're neighbors. I could almost see her from my window on the Isle of Wight. And thank you also very much, Michael, for coming in, commenting, participating to this very important discussion. Naturally, many friends and colleagues at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, so I know we'll collaborate further as well. So without further ado, I'd like to share my screen and start a short presentation. See, it worked before, it should work again. Right. Is that okay? Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, everybody. So the title of my presentation, End Statelessness and Labor Exploitation. Well, we'll try to work on that and try to see what we can achieve, but that's really very much the ambition today. So as you explained, this is a joint seminar between our two institutions, and I'm particularly delighted about this first collaboration. Thank you so much again. So the general question, and this is something Professor Liu just said, you know, we're talking about citizenship, citizens, what it is today. And as you said in the introduction, it's a particularly ambiguous concept, because it's not only the idea of having the citizenship of a given state, but also the fact of belonging. As you understood from the introduction, and probably when you read the invitation to this webinar, something like 10 million people in the world today are stateless. They don't belong. And we'll talk about the word or the concept, the idea of belonging. These people are denied a nationality, and without one, they are denied their rights, their basic rights. I invite you to take a look at the website of the UNHCR, the Refugee Agency of the UN. You have a variety of situations, and you'll be surprised to find stateless people in Romania, in Iraq, in Bangladesh, in Ivory Coast, in Latvia, actually all over the world, and not necessarily only in developing countries. So please take a look at the website to see, you know, lived experience and stories of stateless people, 10 million people, maybe more, maybe less. It's difficult actually to really know the numbers. Take action. You understood the title of my presentation was quite action orientated. You may have heard about this campaign launched by the UNHCR, I Belong, Indeed Belonging, which aims to end statelessness in about 10 years. I mean, 2024, it was launched in 2014. See again, the plan adopted by the UNHCR, the Global Action Plan to End Statelessness. So again, please take a look at that. Very interesting, with a lot of examples and stories of human lives. So indeed, again, the same reference here. And there are a number of initiatives you can participate to. So stateless and citizenship. What is to be a citizen to start with? As you understood, that's one of the topics of my theme, the research initiative I'm directing at the University of Portsmouth, and it's particularly complex, ambiguous. So citizen, the state of having the rights of a person born in a particular country. So as you understood from that, it's quite country-based. So you have different approaches. So you can be a citizen by birth or a citizen by descent, by blood. The famous two and somehow opposed approaches you study sometimes in law during the first years of your study in international law, the jus sanguinis and the jus soli. However, you have additional forms of contemporary citizenship today. I'm referring, for instance, to the EU citizenship, which comes in addition to your existing citizenship. Imagine you're French, Spanish, or German. So very much, again, the idea of belonging. So what is it to be stateless then? We have two major references, as you probably know already, the 1954 and the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. Interesting title, isn't it? They came at a particular period of time. They came right at the end somehow of a first phase of decolonization, which indeed redefined the borders between state and made a few people stateless. So no wonder they were drafted at that time. So let's start briefly with the 54. So it relates to the status of stateless person, and the 61 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness is also key because it gives a few rights. So the 54 Convention ensures that stateless people enjoy a minimum set of human rights. It also establishes the legal definition of stateless people as someone who is not recognized as a national by any state under the operation of its law. Again, it establishes minimum standards of treatment, and in particular, the respect of certain human rights, the right to education, employment, and housing. So it's going to be important for us when we think about labor exploitation. It also guarantees that stateless people have some sort of identification to travel for administrative assistance to indeed apply these rights, right? So here is the definition, as you can see here from the first article. For the purpose of this convention, the term stateless person means a person who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law. Very interesting terms here. We're not going to get into the technical details, but the state is a problem. The law is a problem. What are we talking about? And we'll have more complication. The 1961 convention, as I said, it's ratified only, as you could see, by 78 parties. The 54 was ratified by 96 parties. It's actually a small number of countries, if you think about it. And if you think about a number of other international conventions, we'll talk about the ILO conventions later. So one of the things we can do, and certainly this is what the UNHCR does, is to lobby, to advocate for more ratification of these conventions. So the 61 convention is interesting in the sense that it insists on the idea of acquiring nationality of the country in which, for instance, children are born. So it's very much, a jus soli perspective, the soul, where you are born, right? Article 1, a contracting state shall grant its nationality to a person born in its territory who would otherwise be stateless. Such nationality shall be granted at birth by operation of law, and etc. So bear that in mind. It's also something extremely important. You see here the parties to the convention 54 and 61. So as I said before, it's relatively limited, and there is a large margin for progression here. All right, so let's step back now, because we're talking about statelessness with regard to what we call labor exploitation. So what is labor exploitation? I would use the term, I think, forced labor, and probably not modern slavery or slavery. I quoted Rousseau to start with about slavery and this sort of impossibility for him at that time. We're in the 18th century, right? They were slaves at that time still very much, and they were legal. But he explained that it's very foolish to think that law can authorize slavery. And then you have another famous quote: no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. That's the Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But let's go back to this idea of labor exploitation and what we mean here. So forced labor, I think that's the term probably we should use, is understood as a broad category encompassing forms of human trafficking and modern slavery. It's defined by several ILO conventions and understood as involuntary work performed under coercion through violence and threats. Physical violence, but generally more subtle forms of violence, debt, retention of identity papers. In the statelessness case, this matters very much. Denunciation of the immigration to the police, psychological manipulation, etc. According to the ILO Forced Labor Convention, forced or compulsory labor is defined as all work or service which is exacted from any person under threat of a penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. So I think you understood the general idea here. So both convention, and that's very much in contrast to the Statelessness Convention, now enjoy quasi-universal ratification, 179, and indeed out of the 187 ILO members as of 2021. So you see, almost universal, really. We've adopted, the International Labour Organization has adopted a few additional tools. For instance, in 2014, the International Labour Conference adopted a protocol to the 1930 Forced Labour Convention. This convention naturally applies to everybody, including children, but again, problem with stateless people. You have generally 47 ILO convention and one protocol ratified by countries like India, for instance, just to give you an idea, an application. Right, so now we talk about Bonnie's specialism, human trafficking. So is it often associated with forced labor and often associated as well, probably we'll discuss that later, with statelessness? So again, in 2000, the United Nations adopted a protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in person, especially women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. It's the first legally binding instrument with an internationally recognized definition of human trafficking, and it's part of the United Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, as I said. So as you see here, it's a bit small. Trafficking in person shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of person by means of threats, for instance, of forces, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, etc. So you understand here again, and there's a term which is particularly interesting, that you have an element of violence, of coercion. And in particular, you're targeting people in position of vulnerability. So necessarily, stateless persons are in a position of vulnerability. So this is where these two things intersect. Right, so what about modern slavery? So that we use or we don't use this term, depending on what we want to do and achieve when we talk about statelessness. So it's the term, as you know, which is often used by the media and other society, civil society organization. It refers to contemporary forms of forced labor, which are close to slavery, but there's an element of ambiguity here again. Probably about 40 million people are still in this type of situation worldwide, and there's obviously nothing modern to that. In the UK, we've adopted in 2015 the Modern Slavery Act, which was quite cutting edge at the time, which is discussed and provides a sort of national application of the same concepts. So tribal minorities, indigenous people, and obviously stateless people are particularly vulnerable. You remember the definition of human trafficking to slavery for traditional cultural reasons and obviously for practical legal reason, as if there was some form of lawlessness for the stateless people. Right, so again, slavery, just to give you a few more elements, it's defined by the Slavery Convention. Status, a condition of a person over whom any or all the power attaching to the rights of ownership are exercised. The idea of ownership, but I think here, we can just keep that in mind, and it's not going to be too much at the center of our discussion. So what about the topic today? Statelessness and forced labor, or labor exploitation, if you wish, but I think we sort of chosen, or at least I have chosen, to focus on the idea of forced labor. So indeed, it's slightly difficult to find evidence. Maybe my colleague from Taiwan are going to tell me that they found a lot of evidence through, very practical studies and field work in Asia and East Asia. But to what extent these people are indeed exploited, it's intuitive, of course, because knowing their status, they would try to secure cheap, flexible, labor. And there are also very often migrants, between countries. And so these people are generally much more vulnerable and much more exploited. But I think we need more interdisciplinary studies. We need more empirical work. And that's one of the reasons I'm delighted to work with you today, because we need to get more evidence of the precise situation and the lived experience of these people. Scholarship is starting to pick up from what I could read, really. You have a number of studies. For instance, I've quoted one here on transnational regimes of labor and statelessness. You've had a special issue of the statelessness and slavery, of the Statelessness and Citizenship review. So I invite you to take a look at that. But again, as I said before, I think much more scholarship is needed based on empirical and interdisciplinary research. So to belong, that's the main question, and that's the question I'm hoping to discuss with you today from this different perspective. What does it mean, and what does it mean for obviously stateless people? To go further, and without shame, I invite you to maybe take a look at a series I'm editing. If you have yourself ideas for publication, I'm more than happy to welcome them. I have a series in Citizenship, Human Rights and the Law, published by Routledge, and there is one book, which is coming up very shortly, on statelessness, determination procedures, and the right to nationality, perspective from Nigeria and comparative perspective everywhere in the world. So again, if you have ideas, production that you would like to share with me, please do so. So these were my brief remarks. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me and for this very kind invitation, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Professor Shukran, for your presentation. So much food for thought. I don't see any questions right now on the chat, but the idea is, if we just pick up on some of the things you raised, and then we move on to Michael Hornig's presentation, which will have a practical element at advocacy channels at the UN. Including the UNHCR campaign, I Belong, but also in the human rights system. One thing that really struck me in your presentation is the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. Isn't that phrasing really interesting? It's almost like an implicit acceptance that we will have the statelessness problem pretty much forever, because we're not talking about elimination, which is the language we use with respect to forced labor. Right, but isn't that odd?
Yeah, it is, Bernie. It's an excellent question. Thank you so much. But I think we have to place that, in a context, the context of decolonization. So I suppose that at the time it was a bit overwhelming, but I also find the phrasing quite funny, the reduction of statelessness, as if you would have to have stateless people forever. Well, it's also probably, decolonization, and it might be cynical or pragmatic. Don't you think that the borders of states, the state equilibrium, the order of the world changes all the time? See, today we have a war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, something we did not necessarily expect, although, there were already signs for some time. But recently we have other major conflicts in Syria, in Yemen. So the borders of state also move. And so it's likely that you'll still have people who are caught into these international conflicts and move from one state to the other, or babies born in a situation which is particularly ambiguous, refugees having babies, you see. So maybe it's cynical, and maybe it's also pragmatic.
Yeah, really interesting use of terminology. And thank you for drawing so explicitly the link with forced labor and labor exploitation in general. And for making the point, I'm so glad you make it, that modern slavery is a term that we use quite often, but really there's nothing modern about slavery, right? We're just looking at the contemporary discussion of a challenge that has been, ongoing. So it's continuation of the struggle. But
Indeed.
Would you say that most stateless people would be in the informal economy because of their inability to get a very formal contract, maybe even things like opening bank accounts where the deposit of their wage could be deposited?
I suppose so. I'd like to see more statistics, and that's why, I thought it'd be really nice to have a more, in-depth study. I couldn't really find very clear evidence. I suppose that in countries which, are parties to this convention, they are parties, they're supposed to provide stateless people with a number of, documents and identification, etc. So then they're not necessarily forced to work in the informal sector, right? Because they can be recognized, they can have access to certain, facilities, and they can, enjoy their rights, some rights. But in states which are not parties to these conventions and which have no particularly legal, framework for stateless people, naturally, they're going to try to find what's available. And so it's going to be the informal system, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely working with a lot of vulnerabilities. Professor Liu has a question.
Yeah, I just
yes, thank you,
want
Professor Liu.
Join before we move on to further activist issues. I just want to echo what Leila just mentioned. There's a very ambiguous and also tricky concept of citizenship or statelessness. because we don't need to really encounter, of course, refugees caused by the wars and also the change of citizenship constitution and so on. Those would cause this statelessness. But oftentimes when we encounter cases of migrant labor or undocumented migrant labor or migrant fishers at sea, those people oftentimes their rights are totally neglected, okay, as if they don't belong to any nationality. I mean, if they, for example, in this those distant fishers, the exploitation or the violation of their basic fundamental human rights, it's even though they join this, they sign their letter of agreement or some informal contract voluntarily, but they are actually tricked, or they are deceived, and they are shifted to the ships with convenient flag, and they are actually tortured or bullied or forced to work for maybe 16 hours or even 18 hours a day. So those zones are zones without legal protection or without state. So those are the things that's happening all the time in the 21st century. But also people can get their outsource their recruitment to at for example Cambodia or all over. So those are the cases that we can see. So the statelessness doesn't need to be at a war zone. It could be in this very civilized urban spaces, or this very much nationalized business. Yeah. So this is the issue that I want to also just bring up before we forget.
Yeah, that's very important, actually. Thank you so much for, giving this sort of precision, Professor Liu, because indeed, while statelessness might be created because of a conflict or war, then the exploitation of people does not result from that, as you said. And I'm glad you used the example of the blue economy, because that's something we're very much working on. And I'm afraid because of somehow the layers of lawlessness, right? It's at sea, so it's extremely complicated. You have competing jurisdiction and sometimes gray, if not completely black areas of law. And to that, you add up the statelessness of people. So this is hyper vulnerability, so to speak. To use a word which I'm not so sure about, I don't know, we'll discuss that later. Vulnerability, vulnerable, this is a bit like modern slavery. It's a buzzword at the moment, but I always prefer to use the language of rights. I think it's always clearer, but again, let's talk about that later, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I think both of your remarks, Professor Shukran and Professor Liu, sets up the talk really well for Michael Hornig, who will have the challenge now of telling us how to fix this at the UN from Geneva, from the urban space of Geneva, and also broadly. I think this is just the beginning of a very long conversation. And Michael, onwards to you.
All right, that is a daunting task, but I'll try. So thank you, Dr. Ling, for giving me the floor. I will quickly try to share my PowerPoint as well, just to make things a bit clearer. All right, it should be visible right now. So building on Professor Shukran's remarks on the legal sides of statelessness and beyond. What I want to focus on is looking towards solutions, at least in terms of advocating for the right to a nationality and the right of stateless people, which I will come to the distinction later. Before doing that, before looking at the international legal tools, I do want to make some remarks on what statelessness is when it comes to advocacy, or some of the more important points that is important to address, and then also come back to the relationship to human or to labor exploitation. So as Professor already mentioned, but I still wanted to reiterate the definition that I at least used for this presentation, as a stateless person, as a person who is not considered as a national by any state under the operations of law. This, of course, is a very short sentence for a complicated and technical issue, but nevertheless, it's a good starting point. The nationality as a access to other fundamental rights is something that came up quite soon after the Second World War. So you had Hannah Arendt, who was herself born in Germany but rendered stateless during the Second World War, who called it the right to have rights. So without a nationality, there's a limited amount of things that you can do. And I think you can best explain it by thinking about your own experiences of when the last time is that you used your citizenship. This could have been to gain access to education. It could be to sign your formal labor contract. It could have been to travel. It could have been to get married. It is a quite essential element of your legal identity, let alone identity, but that's a separate issue. So just to reiterate the importance, even though also on this, the right to nationality is the right to have rights. Of course, I think anyone in this webinar could agree that also stateless people have rights. It's just the way that we organized our international legal system as and the interplay between the state and its subjects makes it a bit more complicated. Now, when it comes to advocacy, what makes it challenging is that the causes of statelessness are not a uniform thing. You can get stateless by just a clash of jurisdiction. So there's more technical side when you fall between jurisdictions, born in one country, parents from another, habitant in yet another, that you simply fall within the nationality laws of the individual states. Now, the number is limited, but it used to be a much bigger problem. Now, more contemporary issues that lead to statelessness and which not many people are aware of is starts with gender discrimination. So you have about 25 states globally where only the father can give citizenship to his child, whereas the mother, even though she is the one giving birth, does not, right? So you can imagine that in such a context, when the father is out of the picture or he passed away, or often where you cannot prove your marriage, then the child is at risk of becoming stateless. And this is an issue, for instance, in Lebanon, where if you marry between two religions, then your marriage is not recognized often, and then the child will become not a national of Lebanon. A similar thing goes for discrimination in general, which is often an underlying cause, but in some cases more directly. Professor Liu already mentioned the Rohingya, who have been deprived of their citizenship in 1982, simply because the government of Myanmar at the time decided that this group no longer belonged to the country. Then state succession, depending on the context, could be an important one. So that is simply because of the chaos, for instance, when the Soviet Union fell apart, that you have individuals who fell between the cracks of the newly formed states. So let's say you have been born in what we now call Russia, but then have been your entire life in Kyrgyzstan, it could mean that you fall in between simply because the two new countries couldn't decide on fitting citizenships. Then birth registration, I want to mention it because often registration in general, even though undocumentation is something else than being stateless, oftentimes just having the documentation is an important, is an essential element of gaining citizenship. So you have to prove who you are using your documents. So that is something that that is underlying as well. And then increasingly have countries which use deprivation of citizenship as a political tool. So I want to mention Bahrain, which has increasingly used revocation of citizenship of opposition leaders as a tool to silence that opposition. Because the moment that you take away passport, you can declare someone illegal in your country and try to deport that person. So that is just to say that when it comes to when we want to advocate on an international level, it's important to keep in mind that one context can be completely different than another, yet lead to the similar problem of statelessness. As an example of which I've worked myself, so that is one that I'm most familiar with, is Thailand. Just to give an indication of how these different causes also work together, and I come back later to this example when talking about advocacy. In Thailand, there are two main issues when it comes to statelessness. One refers to the hill tribes, so-called, which is a set of different ethnic groups living on the northern border of Thailand, who historically already were discriminated against and associated with negative stereotypes. That in combination with lack of civil registration, illiteracy, difficulties in communicating with the state authorities, which then leads to many without documentation or becoming stateless. The problem here is that the moment that the parents are stateless, it's very difficult to prove that then the child is a Thai national. So you get an intergenerational issue, which is hard to solve. And then the Rohingya, where we already talked about 1982, and then even though there were previous flows of refugees already in 2017, that came to a climax in what could be called a genocide, where many of the Rohingya fled to Bangladesh, Malaysia, Thailand, and other countries in the region, who also there would be stateless. Now about Taiwan, I'm less apt to go in depth, but there are two excellent professors who maybe could elaborate on that, where we talk mostly about Tibetans and Chinese descendants in Thai and Myanmar, who later came to Taiwan. Then to build on the link with labor exploitation, we already talked about the more vulnerable position that you have without nationality, which comes more generally from the fact that without a passport you can have limited access to education, the labor market, medical services, etc. In combination with underlying discrimination, financial issues. One thing that is also important to mention, that often when you're stateless, you're officially you're not a citizen of the state, so that makes you a foreigner, even though you have nowhere else to go, according to the domestic system. So in some context, if you don't have a residence permit, that means you're illegal and you face risk of detention.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is particularly so in some context in the Gulf, especially. You have the kafala system, which is not exactly statelessness, but
Also, they indicate the importance of citizenship. Foreign workers who come to Qatar have to hand in their passport to their employer, and in that sense, become more vulnerable to exploitation. So once again, not stateless, but still similar issues. And this all combined makes someone who is at risk of stateless or who is stateless much more prone to human trafficking, or much more willing to pay smugglers to move to a different country in order to find work, often in the informal sector. And then finally, before I move on to how you can actually improve the situation, I think COVID-19, we've all experienced it, laid open many of the issues that were already affecting stateless people, including discrimination, but also when it comes to documentation, in order to get tested, in order to get your vaccination, in different contexts that led to problems simply because they were excluded from the state responses towards COVID. And I brought up a quote from former High Commissioner for Refugees and current Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, in 2011 said that statelessness goes undetected because people are afraid to show up. And this is something that reoccurred in the more recent context, simply because you, well, in the language of the UNHCR, you don't belong. Well, you should belong, but according to the state, often you don't. Now, fortunately, and we go beyond the statelessness conventions, also within more broadly international human rights law, the right to nationality has become quite a fundamental right. So I've put all these different UN conventions here, not because I want to go in depth into each of them, simply to show that in all these fundamental documents, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to nationality has been acknowledged, whether it be more generally, like in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or a prohibition on the discrimination when it comes to right to nationality against women or against racial, ethnic, or other minorities, or only for the child. And I think important to mention here is that it's also been included in the Migrant Workers Convention from 1990. And then in addition, like I mentioned, all human rights are not limited to only people with a nationality. All human rights should apply also to stateless persons. And in addition, you have regional convention and other frameworks that could apply depending where in the world you want to work in. One specific tool that I want to go a bit more in depth, and which is also the subject of the current research that I'm doing, is the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, which is a relatively new framework of the Human Rights Council. So it's been around since about 15 years, where all UN member states. So as Dr. Ling already mentioned here, Taiwan has to work a little harder. But all UN member states, they in a cycle of 4.5 years, they come to Geneva, they present their current state of human rights implementation, regardless of what conventions they have signed. And it is up to all the other members to give recommendations on how to improve your citizenship. So rather than a court setting where you are really on trial, here it's more framed as a dialogue, with the acknowledgement that not every that no state is perfect, and that also provides a tool for NGOs to give input, because once every 4 or 5 years, a particular state is the center of, or the focus of, human rights reviewing here in Geneva. Right, so that attention is something that you can use, and then it fits within a wider framework of UN or regional mechanisms on a domestic level, ombudspersons, etc. So this is quite a novel tool that I believe in. Not that it's perfect, definitely not, but that it is something that NGOs can use. So what we have done, for instance, in 2019, together with 2018, together with Dr. Ling, we submitted a report to the UN elaborating on the statelessness context of Brunei, where you effectively have two issues. One is, again, gender discrimination, and the other is discrimination against people of Chinese descent who live in Brunei. And what we've done here is provide factual information to both the OHCHR and diplomats, which they can use then to give recommendations on Brunei. So we presented this at the UN as well, and we used that opportunity to talk with diplomats and explain to them what the situation is. And you really notice that every time you go, also diplomats that discuss this issue, they learn something that they can later on use as well. So I had one diplomat from Western Europe who, when I explained to her about the gender discrimination, at first didn't believe it. And then only after 5 minutes of explaining, she realized that it is an opportunity to become stateless because of gender discrimination. So those kind of things, they help step by step to bring this to the attention. Now, when we go back to the example of Thailand, where both statelessness and trafficking is an issue, advocacy led to Kyrgyzstan making a recommendation to continue to promote the human rights of stateless people, which was not directly focused on trafficking, but still could be used. Thailand accepted the recommendations, which means that they pledged to, in the next 4 years, to work on this issue. This fits together with recommendations made by other UN organs or expert bodies, such as the CEDAW and the UN Human Rights Committee, who made similar recommendations, but more on trafficking. So here you see that it's really, UPR is something that you should see within the wider UN human rights system, or also the regional and domestic systems. So increasingly here you also see that parliaments are getting more involved. That is something I think for a separate talk as well. How this looked at the global picture is, you see here the amount of recommendations that during the last cycle have been made on statelessness, where you can see that it's really a global issue, and per country it depends what the issue is. We see that South and Southeast Asia, ranging from India towards Malaysia, you see is particularly has gotten a lot of attention, with of course Myanmar as, for the obvious reasons, the country that got most attention. And then finally, just more of a proof that advocacy can work, a correlation between the submissions that we made and the recommendations that were eventually given. And I won't go into detail what all the numbers mean, but this for us was a confirmation that we should continue with our work. Then I want to end with just some further readings, which I will post also in the chat, that you can explore by yourself. And then I'm happy to give the floor back to Dr. Ling.
Thank you, Michael Hornig, for such a wonderful presentation, and also for giving us a little bit of hope, on the way forward. While you were speaking, we had a question from the audience, from Vivian, who asked, what are the work that can be done for the stateless people in the northern border of Thailand? And you addressed it in one of your slides, it was really opportune. But you mentioned for Thailand, through the UPR process, it was recommended to reduce statelessness through the process of more education, special protection for stateless people, and then birth registration. I think this recommendation brings up many other separate issues. I think, first of all, can we just zoom back a little bit and look at why is this such a big problem for the region of Asia Pacific? Because, it is believed that 10 to 15 million, there are 10 to 15 million statelessness people in the world, according to various estimates. But half of them are believed to be in the Asian Pacific. So what are these regional hotspots? Is Thailand one of them? And why is this? And how does it make it difficult for us in this region to eliminate, reduce this growing problem, this invisible problem, in the words of the current Secretary General? Thank you. Any thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, I think, well, when it comes to why Asia Pacific is such a hotspot, I think that is primarily due to some key issues of statelessness. So Myanmar obviously is the gravest one, simply because what it led to. But a lot has to do with, it's always a combination of factors. And I think in Thailand specifically, it has to do with state willingness. So some decades ago, and I think now that it's changing slowly, but some decades ago, there was really a policy of focusing on the Thai identity as part and parcel of the state, without including also the space for ethnic minorities. In the north, I think, birth registration or registration in general is one that is very important. The language is different. So when you go with your documentation to the state authorities, you want to hope that they also speak your language, or the other way around. Illiteracy is one that is also an underlying issue. If you cannot read your documentation, then it is hard to know what to do with it. Discrimination is something that I also refer to. So that is something that in, again, 75% of the cases, at least according to the Special Rapporteur on minority issues, 75% has underlying discrimination as a core issue. And I think only through addressing this holistically is how you could address the situation. I think more generally on South Asia, I mentioned in one of the slides also Assam as that is an upcoming situation where statelessness is becoming an issue, where in the northern east part of India, because the borders with Bangladesh have been so porous for the last decades, there is a lot of migration back and forth. Yet in Assam itself, you also have a substantial part that has been living there for generations. And there the local government has introduced a new census where you have to prove your Indian citizenship, which for many people is impossible. So there you have, and I can't remember numbers, but it's well over 1 million who weren't including in the new list. And the future just has to be seen. What happens to them? Will they be deported? If so, where? Will they live in deportation camps as they are building now, or will the situation turn around and will they be included anyway? That makes it a bit tricky.
Well, thank you for painting this very complex picture of statelessness, but also with so much clarity that we know where the complex threads are. I just want to quickly offer two things. One, you know, as a moderator prerogative, I really liked what you said about it's the mother who carries the child, gives birth, which is not easy, and then cannot pass on the citizenship, you know. Huge travesty, and there are still jurisdictions in the world today where a mother cannot pass on her nationality to the child. And you mentioned that it's one of the reasons, gender discrimination for statelessness in the world today. And the second one is, I noticed that Professor Shukran made a comment about deprivation of citizenship as a threat used even in democratic countries. I was wondering, would you like to quickly ask that or discuss that before we turn the floor to Professor Chow? Leila, Professor Shukran, would you like to answer, or should we pass on the, yeah?
Of course, and Michael, if you have ideas about that, I'd be more than happy to talk about it and to discuss that with the audience. Yes, this is something really interesting and striking. And, you know, Bunny, it relates to your question before, the reduction of statelessness. So are we creating more stateless people? Well, you have to put that in the context, I suppose, of to some extent Islamophobia. You have in democracies, you remember in France, in the UK, threats to Muslim French citizens who have certainly, you know, acted against the state, for instance, or are maybe suspected of terrorism and things like that. The threat to deprive them of their citizenship. Particularly, well, worrying in democracies. Then you have a country like India, and Michael, you just alluded to that, and the problem of borders between India and Bangladesh. And indeed, again, you know, the context is that of Islamophobia, really, because we're talking about population which do not necessarily belong to what is supposed to be the current identity of a given nation. So question mark again. I don't know, what do you think, Michael?
Yeah, I think so. Especially since well, when we can talk about the case of the UK specifically, and it's a broader issue within Western Europe. As a response of for security concerns, but also Islamophobia, which well, often well, they're interlinked. Governments have been pushing for more possibilities to take away citizenship of suspected terrorists or convicted ones. It has to do partly with the fact because the inability to prosecute people for being a member of a terrorist group, or prosecute at all when they are abroad, for instance. The easiest thing when they went to Syria, the easiest thing is just to take away the citizenship. The problem is, though, or one of the many problems, apart from the fact that even intelligence services and public prosecutors have been against these kind of statements because they don't, or these measures because they don't work. But in theory, they only apply to citizenships who have a second nationality, because even under the stateless conventions, you cannot deprive someone from citizenship if they don't have another one, because you're making someone stateless. So that in itself is problematic because, for instance, in the Dutch context, the vast majority of the people that have lost their citizenship because of this have had a Moroccan other citizenship. So that makes it, it wouldn't apply to me, it would only apply to a neighbor who has a second citizenship. Then in the UK specific case, you had the Begum case, which was I think the most famous one in this sense, where the public.
But Neil, I mean, this is really fascinating, so complicated, and I think we're starting to kind of have a sense of how broad the issue is of statelessness. This invisible, neglected, you know, invisible human rights challenge that's facing us, facing, you know, 10 to 15 million individuals in the world today. But I'm just mindful of the time, and I have to bit of the evil timekeeper today. And I know that Professor Chow has the formidable task of just providing some remarks from the perspective, you know, of Taiwan, if you wish, or more broadly from the regions, or more broadly from your area of work, which is on labor law. Professor Chow?
Okay. Thank you very much for a great presentation. Just like Bonnie said, at Taiwan in the international society, we need more knowledge from the international law, because every time when I check the report or any documents, I cannot find anything about Taiwan. But when we talk about some cases about the forced labor, human trafficking, we can always see the track from Taiwan. So how do we understand the situation in Taiwan? It's really a very difficult topic for me. And today we discuss about the topic stateless. And our subtitle is a discussion between Europe and Taiwan. So I want to use only a couple of minutes to mention some situation in Taiwan. But first, because I heard your great presentation today, I asked myself some questions. So maybe if we have enough time, we can discuss. Because just like Michael mentioned, why we talk about the topic of stateless, because, okay, why we talk about the topic of stateless, because we need to have the right to have rights. This is the most important reason we talk about the topic. But because we have deal with all the topic about migrant workers for many years in Asia, and we find out something very challenging, because stateless, or we have if you are not belong to any country, you have a citizenship. But even though the company, the capitalism, they can find other way, other strategy to let you lose your human basic right. Just Professor Joyce just mentioned, we have talked about in another workshop, you are not stateless, but if you work on a FOC ship, a flag of convenience, then you don't have any basic human right. And so I just think about during our the workshop, think the citizenship is an invention by the mother country. And then this is why the citizenship is a condition to let you have your human right. This is another problem. And then what kind of a basic rights is that situation? Anyone should have that. Then they call the basic human right, even you don't have any citizenship. This is one question. I want to take one example in Taiwan, because when we talk about stateless in Taiwan, in the labor market, a very serious problem is we have so many migrant workers working in Taiwan, especially in the social welfare industry, also in the factory or in the fishery industry. And then in the beginning, all of them they are not stateless. They come from mostly from Indonesia or Vietnam, and then they have a document legally, and then they can work in Taiwan. And then the most interesting is like our government always claims all the labor law, especially the Labor Standard Act, apply to all the workers. If you are working in Taiwan, it doesn't matter you are Taiwanese or from Indonesia or from Vietnam, it doesn't matter. Yeah, so that seems in Taiwan, we really have the principle of a natural treatment. Then if under that kind of principle, we don't have any problem. But the second step of our policy is the labor law, especially the Labor Standard Act, does not apply to domestic workers, all domestic workers in Taiwan, and doesn't apply to all the workers if you're working in the far sea fishery industry. But the important is who working in the two industries. Most of them are migrant workers. Then I will understand that this is a kind of indirect discrimination. We say the rights apply all to the workers, or not to the workers. But then if you find out in the end, only the migrant workers working in the industry and the law does not apply to that kind of industry, then this is a kind of discrimination, and they do it not indirect. And the problem is, if that kind of policy really in Taiwan, it doesn't matter you are stateless or not, it's the same. If you don't have a citizenship in Taiwan, you don't have that kind of right. But even you are legally working in Taiwan, you still don't have that kind of right. So I say in the end, it makes no difference. So the problem for me, myself, is to think what kind of, how do we understand human rights? And as you know, Taiwan is not so, does not have access to the international organization. So when we talk about many kind of international convention, then in Taiwan is outside that. And for me, the meaning is the real challenge, the real test, how our government, how our country understand the human rights, even we don't apply to that kind of convention. So they cannot be an excuse. We are outside the international society, then we can have our own understanding for a human rights. They cannot be the consideration, but it seems that now for our industry, especially for the domestic workers and the pharmacy industry, you have heard many cases from Taiwan. It seems like just like the kind of situation. Yeah, so this is my first remark today. I only use 1 minute. And the second thing is, if you're working as a domestic worker in Taiwan, I just said, all the labor law do not apply to you. That means you don't have any rights in Taiwan when you are working. And you even don't get the minimum wage, but you still have a contract. So you have to obey the contract condition, and the condition is so miserable. You don't even get the minimum wage. You work overtime. And for the migrant workers in Taiwan, they have the strategy is they want to leave their employer and then find the freedom, enter to the labor market to find another better job. Then maybe they can earn more. So the problem is, if they work legally in Taiwan, maybe they cannot have their so good labor condition. But if they are working illegally, they might get more pay, and they might get better working condition. I think it's not good future for our society, because everyone tries to escape from your legal employer, try to escape from the legal framework. But for our topic today, stateless or citizenship, what then we call the undocumented workers. The situation by the undocumented workers is just similar to the stateless workers in Taiwan. And then my last comment is, how do we understand the human rights, the basic human rights for them? And Michelle, I just mentioned the COVID-19, the situation. And we know everyone, not everyone, but most people try to get a vaccine, and then they will be protected. But in Taiwan, if you want to get vaccine, you need to show your document. You need to register it in the system. But if you are an undocumented worker, you don't want to give your name. You don't want to show your face. You don't want anyone know where you are. But now, in this serious time, you need to register, and they say, oh, now I'm escaped from my employer. You can trace after me, and I can get protected. It's ridiculous. It cannot be happen. So this is our problem until last year. We see if the whole system, the whole labor law system in Taiwan has a kind of problem. And for them, undocumented workers, maybe in the normal time, they enter into the labor market and get their better working condition. And in the end, to get no any protection from the country, and they are traced from like a criminal from the police. So, but now in this year, our government has another kind of policy. There's some kind of a station run by the NGO, and you don't need to give your name to the government, and you can still get the kind of vaccine and protected. But it's already a little bit late. But this is only an example. I just want to think about the problem is to have a citizenship is very important, but what kind of human rights we still have to have the right to have rights, even you don't have any citizenship, even you don't have any document, even you are working illegal. Working illegal is not a criminal. So you still should have your basic human rights. I think that's the situation in Taiwan. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhou Yufan, for such a passionate remarks on the state of Taiwan today and the problems facing Taiwan's 700,000 known migrant workers, plus what is also believed to be around 50,000 undocumented migrant workers today, and all the associated problems that comes with having a asymmetric employment relationship where migrant workers come to work in Taiwan as they do in other destination economies, indebted and starting on a very disadvantaged footing in their employment relationship. There's so many things to tease out in your remark, but I think the overall impression goes back to what Professor Liu said in the beginning, which is that this is just an appetizer event. This is an introduction to a whole series of events that will come in January of next year. And even then, I think this is a long-term discussion because what Leila said in her presentation about the international framework being framed on reduction of statelessness, whereas forced labor is, the language is one of elimination, there's inherent tension. And this is not going to go away in the short term. I just want to say that for the Taiwan recently released its first national human rights plan. And it would be 2 years between now and 2024. So human rights definitely is a fast evolving picture in Taiwan. And Taiwan doesn't have UPR, Universal Periodic Review, that Michiel talked about in his presentation. But we do have many, many committed scholars at阳明交通大学, but also elsewhere, looking, right, monitoring, arguing, and shedding, spotlighting, and holding government to account on these human rights issues. So I'm mindful of time. There's only 8 minutes left. Maybe I'll turn back the floor to Professor Liu and then see what other questions also briefly come back in the general discussions. Thank you so much. Professor Liu, the floor is yours.
Yeah, all right. I think there are a few points that we need to just keep thinking. One thing is actually Michiel or Bonnie mentioned, why is there so much problems emerging in Asia Pacific? We need to bear in mind that it's not only Europe, but Asia Pacific or Asian countries, especially Southeast Asian countries, geographical, during this colonial period, the government arbitrarily draw the line of borders and separate different ethnic groups. We need to realize that like Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, they have thousands or more than 2,000 or 3,000 of languages or ethnic groups. Okay, but now they are dominated by one ethnic group. For example, Malay or Indonesia or Viet or Thai. But so the minority groups are very easily not only discriminated, but they can be, their citizenship right could be abolished just overnight. But, this is something that we need to look closer, maybe to study. The second thing is that this gender discrimination, because now we are having more and more students from Middle East, Palestine, or Jordan, and we just had a Muslim film festival last year. So because of all these Muslim students in our on campus, we maybe I can share the link just a few minutes. Let me see. One issue is that our women students need to go back to their country every 6 months, even though they are second or third generation of Jordanian, or they are from Palestine, but then they cannot obtain their citizenship. So there are already several students expressing these difficult circumstances, they are also working on the issues of citizenship, Palestinian citizenship or Jordanian citizenship, especially for women. Okay, their mother are Jordanian citizens, but they cannot become a citizen of Jordanian citizen. So, but this, according to my understanding, there are many countries like this. So there are still a lot to do in terms of this, their right. The third is that I do think we need to reconsider the definition of citizenship, not to be totally determined by nationality. Citizen, city dweller, people who live here, they co-inhabit. So we are talking about how to do this commoning the space, commoning the city. That is all people who live here, work here, they should belong. This is a concept, I think, for today. We should not let the so-called citizen be hijacked by this nationality. Not to mention this, it's no primacy nationality. So this is something that we also need to discuss further. Yeah. Maybe you have.
I think that segues very well into the theme of democratic citizenship, on what you're trying to foster, Professor Shukran, on all these interdisciplinary discussions that we've been having, looking at the issues of democracy and citizenship. Would you like to say a few words, since we're also, in principle, ending this Research Futures webinar in collaboration with Professor Liu and her team?
No, I can only agree with what Professor Liu just said. You know, citizenship goes beyond borders, state borders, and it's more about your identity as a human being, where you belong to, rather than simply having been given one nationality by a given state. So there are plenty of things that we need to explore, because it raises a number of questions in terms of indeed labor exploitation, but also some forms of opportunities, creativity, belonging, contribution to the place where you live. And what I particularly like in our collaboration, nascent collaboration, is that it's very interdisciplinary. I personally love to use creative methods, co-creation of knowledge, critical studies, and this is how you understand better a given situation. So I'm particularly excited about this work, which is going to take more shape in the coming months.
Yeah, I look forward to it too.
And also the advocacy angle of changing policies on the ground, right? With better knowledge comes better reform.
Absolutely. Advocacy is certainly part of our academic work in terms of, you know, how we impact, to use a buzzword, but certainly policy changes are very much part of our work. I was wondering if we have a few more seconds. Do we have a few questions from the audience, or don't we have?
Yeah, we should take some questions from the floor. Yeah, let's wait a little bit. Yeah. Also, I noticed from the audience, there's one hand raised. From the audience, there are also people from Taiwan Human Rights Association, but I think he left. But in our past events, some law people, human rights people from Taiwan, they participated in our webinar. So. But also there are many people from Southeast Asian countries or students from Indonesia and other Vietnam and so on. So Isabel, you want to raise your hand? No, you want to speak up?
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me. I can't turn my I can't turn my video on, so I will just talk. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for the event. I was curious about, because after listening to what you have discussed, I don't know if it's so remote from what we're talking about today, but I was curious about what is from Taiwan, what is your view on the very fact that Taiwan is very hesitant to adopt any legislation to accept refugees. Taiwan historically has been accepting from earlier times from the Chinese mainland in the 1950s and becoming a big political campaign. Later, Taiwan also accepted a smaller number, probably around 3,000, 3,500, the so-called boat people from Vietnam during the war. But now more and more challenges seem to be how Taiwan manages a relationship with Hong Kong, because it's probably more likely if Taiwan is going to become a harbor for refugees, that will be mostly from Hong Kong. I don't know if two specialists here know a bit more about this thing. And of course, if a legislation is adopted, it won't be just the Hong Kongers, it will open the door for more, perhaps even from Palestinian community, from Ukrainian, we don't know. But I'm just curious about what is your take on this. Thank you.
I just say a few words, maybe Yifan can add, but it has been discussed in recent years, right, seriously. So, but there are flexible ways. I know that there's a student from Ukraine who has been transported to Taiwan and who just applied and admitted to our program. So the channel, I think there are some alternative channels, okay? Not to mention people from Hong Kong. But there are maybe other concerns. Isabel, you want to continue, or the hand is a new hand, or?
No, it is me being stupid. I should not put it down, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Yifan, you want to talk about it?
Okay, just a few words. We know this week is just the World Refugee Week, and we are talking about the policy in Taiwan, and we already have that problem because maybe we have some policy for the refugee, especially from Hong Kong or Ukraine, but in a general policy, we are still, is still in discussion. And another problem is because my field is for the labor, and for the migrant worker in Taiwan, it's very strict. That means we still take the migrant workers in Taiwan. Maybe they are working here for 15 years, but they are still a guest worker in Taiwan. They will not take any civil rights here. And then maybe next workshop, we can discuss. Our government finally had a new policy in Taiwan. You are allowed from a migrant worker to get your citizenship, but under very strict condition. So it maybe will not be efficient. So it's another big policy. We can discuss that next time. Thank you.
But Isabel was mentioning Refugee Act, 难民法。台湾谈过，可是还没有。It has been discussed but not passed yet. But Jonathan has a question. You want to speak up?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yeah. My question is derived from my experience that so many migrant workers in Taiwan involved in criminal activities, and soon after they are arrested by the law enforcement, they are prosecuted. And the problem with the prosecution in Taiwan, sometimes it takes years to get the final verdict or the sentence, right? And during this process, the victim have to submit another report whether they are to request for human trafficking, whether they're being victim of human trafficking or forced labor to do the criminal activities. But and then my question is how we can understand the statelessness in this context. Like, yeah, because during the investigation, which sometimes takes years, they don't have rights to how to say, they just detain in prison. They just detain in prison without access to the outside of the world. Like, if it is involving drugs, they will not get access for 4 months. So yeah, so it's difficult for me to understand the statelessness in this context, whether they are being stateless, whether even though they are legally employed in Taiwan. So, yeah.
This is a tough question. I don't know whether people can address that. Maybe let's get another question, Su-Han, and then we'll see whether we can ask someone to address the questions together. Su-Han. You want to speak up? Su-Han, you raise your hand. Do you want to speak up? But
while we're waiting,
yeah.
While we're waiting for Su-Han, I can tell Jonathan, I think that is a complicated legal question. We can take it offline and do it more in depth. But just quickly, this issue touches upon the concept of non-punishment in human trafficking, where the person is being exploited for a criminal purpose. We have cases in the UK and also that appeared in front of the European Court of Human Rights that has ramifications for your question. So we can just take it offline. But I think in general, and it goes back to conceptual clarity, we need to kind of understand that dynamics might be the same, but the definition and labeling is different. A stateless person is a person without a nationality, whereas migrant workers that you're speaking of, they probably can access some type of consular service in Taiwan, you know, if they're not if they're not statelessness. So I think we just, answering a question in a way to kind of say, well, let's go back and look at the details, and then we can maintain some of the conceptual clarity so we can tease out all the relevant questions. Thank you.
So Hannah, I think you are back. You want to speak up?
Yeah, yes, could you hear me? Yes, so my name is Su-Han and I work at Taiwan Association for Human Rights. And I just would like to answer as much as I could to the question about why Taiwan hasn't yet passed a national refugee law. And so actually, as the whole civil society has been pushed for the passage of a national refugee law for more than a decade, but actually the concern over the national security pretty dominates the whole issue, especially most of the asylum seekers are from mainland China and recently from Hong Kong. Like politically, the politician has expressed the support over the democracy and the Hong Kong protesters coming over to Taiwan, but still the whole society seems to reserve against how Taiwan can take care of or how these Hong Kong protesters can integrate into the local society. And in addition to that is that another, I would say, like the general feeling is that the society feel Taiwan has no like an international responsibility to taking asylum seekers since Taiwan is excluded from the whole United Nations systems. So yeah, it's some of the reasons that explains why we hasn't had yet a refugee law, and the government is like quite like they are not inactive at all. They are very inactive at all on this issue. Thank you.
Just add? Yeah, can I just add a few more words to that? Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I know that I think the general concern in Taiwan is that if the government allows the Hong Kongers, or in the past, in 20 years ago, it's probably Chinese, they're going to be competing jobs. They're going to compete in the to buy they're going to drive the house market even up more than what local people can afford. So I think it's a very interesting love and hate relationship with the Hong Kongers, because on the one hand, Taiwan really has taken advantage of the situation in Hong Kong to show that how Taiwan does need to go independent. But on the other hand, the situation in Hong Kong also makes Taiwanese citizens think twice. Do we really want more competitors to come into our education market, our job market, our housing market? And that is all understandable. But what is interesting, though, is that if you look at what has been submitted to the Legislative Yuan, there's no shortage of legislative drafts. I counted before, there were about 11 drafts being submitted. Mostly, I think 10 out of 11 were submitted by the DPP legislators, only one submitted by the KMT legislator. And I think that also shows how the within the political circle, how this issue being really it's been seen as a really uncomfortable situation. So this is all understandable. But I think what you said is quite interesting, that if Taiwanese people think we're not part of the international society, hence we have no responsibility, that is something more to do with political discourse, I think, rather than the political calculation of these legislators. So that is my immediate thoughts. But anyway, thank you very much for the response. It's very useful.
Yeah, I just want to add one more point. Yeah, there has been like a priority bills in the the legislative year, which is like the corresponding parliaments. But yes, whenever they are as like a minority in the parliaments, they will like propose the refugee bills into a legislative year, but when they are the dominant parties, then they can resistant to have this law passed. But yeah, I think we are still like the system is still trying to figure out, is it better or not to have a refugee law in like considering the international reputation. Because I think to a certain degree, if we have at least refugee bills, which is kind of a human rights bill, I think it increased over, yes, that Taiwan's international reputation. Like we have a same-sex marriage law passed like 2 or 3 years ago. But meanwhile, people do have concern that if we have this legislation, if we have this law passed, then how if there are a lot of asylum seekers come after this legislation. I think some of the people have this impression from the mainstream media that share the image mainly happens in maybe in Europe or in Germany. So they have this misconception, perceived about same thing will also happen in Taiwan if we pass the law. So yeah, I think it's the overall situation. But thank you also for your feedbacks.
Well, there are still work to be done. It's easy to persuade us here who participated this webinar, but of course there are more things to be done. Yeah. So maybe we shall call it a day. Okay. Thank you, Bonnie, for sharing this article, and people can also learn from it. And I'm sure the reason that we are here is because there are more things that need to be done. Okay, both intellectually, discursively, and also through activist participation and different ways, including artistic intervention, so that maybe more work can be circulated and change people's ideas and thoughts and so on. So we will continue. We will continue. All right. Thank you so much for today's sharing. And I believe there are more questions on said, but those are the questions we need to address through our writing and through our discussion from now. Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So we'll come back. Okay. Yeah. Let's keep up. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day, everyone.
You too.
Great night.
Yes.
Bye.
Yes. Bye-bye.